Yeah.
Welcome to Slayer the Alchemist, and welcome to another edition of Sabbath Sunday. This is where Darren and I get together with you to discuss all things Black Sabbath. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing Geezer Butler's new book called Into the Void: From Birth to Sabbath and Beyond. I think I got that correct. Did I get that correct, Darren?
From Birth to Black Sabbath and Beyond.
All right. Yeah, as you can probably tell here, I'm not at my usual lair location. I don't have my camera. I don't have my microphone. Darren had some technical difficulties. He's on a different system, so we've got a little bit of a different look for you here today. But it's all about the discussion, and we're here to talk about Geezer's book. Geezer now, three out of the four original Black Sabbath members have released books. Ozzy has a book, Tony has a book, and now Geezer releases his book. What'd you think of it, Darren?
Mhm. Loved it. I started reading it, and from the first page, it just sucked me in. It was really hard to put down. I didn't read it all in one sitting like someone I know, but I finished it up in a couple days. I think it took like 3.5 days. It was just really, it was a real page turner. Even, when you read these things, sometimes, as much as you like a musician or entertainer or whoever it is whoever's autobiography you're reading about, it could sometimes get a little bit boring hearing about when they were kids and they were growing up and stuff like that. You really want to get to like the heart of the matter, the reason you're interested in them. And of course, in Geezer's case, we're all interested in Black Sabbath. So initially, I knew I was going to be in a situation where I was going to be reading about how he grew up and where he lived. And for the third time, hearing about Birmingham and how poor it was and all those circumstances that they had to go through. But with Geezer's, I mean, it moved along really quickly, and it was interesting. The relationship he had with his parents was interesting. His brothers, he really painted a really good picture of all the people in his life at that time, and it was really interesting. So I got through that, and it just moved along really well. And um, the things that I had always wondered about. I don't want to spoil it. I'm hesitating because I don't want to let any of the details go because there's going to be people watching this and haven't read it yet. But it was really really informative, and it I guess I didn't really expect a whole lot from Geezer as far as like content of you know what was really going on in the band. Geezer seems to be the more reserved member of the band. Bill's a wild man. Of course, we all know Ozzy and Tony's kind of the brains behind the operation. But um, I was interested in hearing about Geezer because what Geezer's perspective was on things because I read Ozzy's book and I read Tony's book, so Geezer was up. But I mean, I got to say, I was probably more entertained by Geezer's book, and there was a lot of really interesting factoids, and the way that he laid everything out was really well organized. Um, and it was as though while I was reading it, I could hear his voice in my head. So it was like Geezer was there as I was reading it. Whereas with Tony and even Ozzy's, it seemed a little bit more sterile in comparison. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was a fast read and highly recommend it. Really entertaining.
Yeah, like you, I was not sure what to expect, being that Geezer is the quietest out of the four original guys. There's you
Yeah.
can find interviews out there with Tony and Geezer where Geezer literally says nothing. Tony does all the talking. So I really wasn't sure how open Geezer was going to be. And as much as I liked Tony's book and Ozzy's book, and more so Tony's book, I kind of felt like Iommi didn't open up maybe quite as much as I would have liked him to, and so I wasn't sure what to expect with Geezer's book. But I was pleasantly surprised at how you kind of feel like you really get to know him, better than
Yeah.
as us as Black Sabbath fans, hardcore, diehard Black Sabbath fans. I knew we were going to get a lot of things that we already knew. You get the Ozzy Zig needs a gig story. You get, some of these things that we've heard a lot, but there was enough other stuff, like you mentioned, his early life. And often a fault of books like this is that it can take too long to get to what you're really there for, which is, the music,
Right.
the band. But Geezer moves through it fairly quickly, and he does it in such a way that it sort of helps you understand who Geezer is and how his upbringing really played a part in his personality, whether it be his Catholic upbringing, the Aston Villa football team, right? The stadium right
Big,
down the
big
street from
part of it.
him,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. His brothers and sisters living in Aston and Birmingham, and just how all that shaped who he was. I thought it was really interesting, and again, it does move really quickly. As I often do when I get books like this, because the book is basically the chapters. Basically, once he gets into the band, it's basically like an album per chapter. So, of course, when I
Mm.
got the book, one of the first things I did is, as I often do with books like this, this was like the day before the Live Evil box was supposed to come out, and I was, I wonder what Geezer thinks of Live Evil. So I read the Live Evil section. Then I was like, I want to hear what he says about the band breaking up. So I read so I jumped around a little bit, and then the next day I just sat down and I read it from beginning to end. And like you said, it's just really easy. I read it in a day. It was one of those things I just couldn't put it down. There were a few things that did strike me though that uh, it's nice to see. You hear all of these stories about their early years and stuff, and Geezer lays it out in a nice sort of chronological way to give you a real feel for how things evolved. And there's some really great moments in it. Like there's one part where he talks about him and Ozzy going over to Tony's house, and Bill's at Tony's house, and
Mhm.
and he goes, they're all talking on the steps in front of Tony's house, and he goes, "This is the first time all four of us were together in one place." And that sent a little bit of a shiver up my spine. I was like, "Wow,
Yeah, I
yeah,
was
that
gonna
is
say, yeah, me too.
that is." And the way he talks about what one thing that really made an impression on me was reading the story of their early years and the long drives and the van breaking down, the weird club owners and doing weekly stints at some place where the food is bad or there's no heat. You just all the stuff that they went through, and it really made me realize, and we talk about this a lot in our podcast and here on Sabbath Sunday, that those four original guys, they have a bond, they have a connection that could never really be. It has to be the four of them. And when you read about what they went through and where they came from, you understand, at least I felt like I understood what that connection was, that everything they went through, where they came from, there is just a bond between those four guys that it can't be reproduced really by anybody else. You have to have gone through what they went through, to have that sort of connection that they had. And but I just thought it was great when and he says some things too that I sort of didn't expect. He was a little that made me sort of look at things a little bit differently, like with Ozzy getting let go from the band. The common story is Ozzy was out of his mind on booze and drugs. And Ozzy's reply is always everybody in the band was out of their minds at that time. But Geezer sort of paints it not just the booze and the drugs, but how unreliable Ozzy had become towards the end, is not almost missing shows and not being involved in the Never Say Die album. And it sort of gives you this sort of different picture that the band was really struggling during Never Say Die. And Ozzy wasn't helping the situation any.
Sure,
He was
sure.
making the situation worse with his behavior and his drugs and everything. When you read sort of Geezer's side, it's like it's almost he forced their hand, like Ozzy was trying to get them to fire them. But it's if you're a hardcore Sabbath fan and you think, man, I've heard all the stories, I really don't need to read this. I encourage you to get it because uh, there are enough little factoids and hearing Geezer tell these stories from his perspective gives you sort of a little bit of a different insight on the band, the history of the band, when Ronnie was in the band, when Ronnie left the band, just everything in general. So, like Darren has said, and I said, it's a quick read. It's a pretty easy read, and it was very enjoyable. There were moments that I laughed. There were moments that I felt like getting a little choked up when he talked about Ronnie's passing, when he talks about his mother and his father passing, and his relationship with his wife, everything, his kids and all that stuff. So there's enough personal stuff in there, but there's also enough Black Sabbath stuff. It's done really nice. And like you said, it does really feel like it's Geezer reading it. And from what I understand, there's an audio version of the book with Geezer reading the book. So I can only imagine how
Yeah.
much fun that is. Although I found it interesting that they must have got him or they just changed it in the book. And I'd be curious if when he does the audio book, if he does a Geezer always says me bass, me friends, that kind of thing. He doesn't
Yeah.
do that in the written form of the book. And I'm curious in the audio form of the book if he does that, because that's to me always such a signature thing of Geezer's. I'd love to hear this book with his accent and
Yeah.
everything, him telling these stories. That must be a lot. I'm almost tempted to get the audio book, even though I've already read it, just to hear it in Geezer's own voice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way that the book is phrased, the way that it's written, the sentence structures and everything is if it's was dictated. Somebody wrote down what Geezer was saying as he went along. Another thing that I wanted to add about the book is that he doesn't hold back. He doesn't paint a bad picture necessarily. That's up to you to decide about the people that were in and out of Black Sabbath and managers and whomever else was a part of the institution at the time. But he doesn't hold back, and so I appreciate that because I don't really I want to get into what was actually happening at that time. I don't want him to be polite. I don't want him, well, because Dio's dead. I don't want him to be insincerely, reverent to him. He's not, or to Ozzy. Ozzy, it's funny because the main character, I think, other than Geezer, he paints such illustrative uh, things about the band members. Tony has a really strong personality, the way that Geezer presents him in the book, and Ozzy does it. Ozzy almost is like comic relief. You might think
Yeah,
that Ozzy, in all his foibles, would be the one who would be the most tragic, but he's not. It's actually Bill, and you do feel sorry for Bill. And I think I learned more about Bill through Geezer's book than I have in any other in Tony's book or even Ozzy's book. And it's all from his perspective, which I really appreciate. But he doesn't hold back. I mean, the things we'd heard, the things we read in other Black Sabbath biographies are pretty much confirmed. When he talks about the lyrics, he gives Ozzy credit. He gives credit where credit's due, and he takes away credit where it is. And one of the people, I mean, again, I don't want to spoil it, but I think people might be surprised about the way that Geezer treats Dio,
hmm,
the way that his treatment of Tony Martin a little bit.
yeah,
He doesn't hold back. And what I really appreciated was I always wondered, well, what was Geezer think? I mean, Ozzy was off and he had a successful solo career. Bill was just sort of out there somewhere doing whatever it is that Bill had to do at the time. But Geezer was always pretty together, and I always wondered when he wasn't in Black Sabbath, what did he think about what Tony was doing? And that's
yeah,
answered, and it's answered very honestly, and I appreciate that too. I really felt like I got a lot more information and a lot more insight about Black Sabbath through Geezer's book.
yeah,
And that's what I was hoping to get, and I'm really pleased about that. But it's not very long. I think it's like what 257 pages.
yeah,
Um, it's a little bit, and I think the other thing about it is that it's written from the perspective of everything's done now.
Yeah.
So I'm going to tell the story of Black Sabbath from the very beginning. Well, from my life and how I started and how I came into this band, but the history of Black Sabbath from the very beginning to the very end. And if you're
Yeah.
wondering if there's, well, I'm not going to, again, I'm not going to like reveal too much, but it's definitely from the beginning to the end of the band. And of course, Aston Villa is a main character, the football team that he's.
Yeah.
I had no idea he was such a big sports fan, but he is. He's a really really big football fan. Football in the English sense, traditional football, I guess you'd call it. But yeah, I loved it. I thought it was great. And I'd read it again. In fact, I probably will, because sometimes you miss certain things. And the other thing is Geezer's book. There's so much detail. There's so much content, and it felt like from the middle towards the end, it was like he knew that he had to get to the finish line
Yeah.
in such an amount of time. So it's like you really had. I mean, it was like
Yeah.
it was things were moving fast from the point where, and I'm going to say for me, it was probably around the late 70s. From the
Yeah.
late 70s to up until and including 13, things move fast. There's a lot of prior to that, there's a lot of his upbringing, his Catholicism, um, his personal experiences with supernatural,
Yeah.
and the way that he was, very sensitive to things like that. But once it gets to the mid to the end of the 70s, it goes by really fast, and there's a lot of information there. So, yeah, it's a very compelling read. I
Yeah, I'm
really
glad you
enjoyed
brought
it.
up the Dio thing, because that also surprised me a little bit, because often when someone's not here anymore, people don't want to be say critical things. And Geezer had a great relationship with Ronnie during Heaven and Hell. He always seemed to have a decent relationship with Ronnie. And so, like you said, he's very honest about the way and he doesn't do it though in like a he's trying to
Gratuity.
attack the person. Yeah, he's just kind of like with Dio, there's that one story about he freaks out because there's a lemon on his dressing room table or something like that. Yeah, and so you sort of get
Yeah.
this little bit, but he doesn't he's sort of like with Ozzy. It's sort of the same way. Like with Ozzy, he talks about Ozzy's faults and everything, but he doesn't do it in like a condescending, judgmental way. He sort of does it
No.
more in like, well, that's Ozzy,
Yeah. And
that's Ozzy. And it's the same
there's
thing
some
with,
really fun. Yeah, there's some really funny Ozzy. Ozzy is he's the comic relief. And like I said, I thought, going into it, Ozzy might be have been portrayed as the tragic character, but he's not. There's some really, really funny laugh out loud things
yeah.
with Ozzy, the
And
stories with
it's
Ozzy.
interesting how another line that I really liked is he says when they first met, and Tony sees Ozzy and he goes, "Not you," or something, "you," or something like that. And he goes, Tony was a year older than Ozzy, and he goes, that dynamic never changed in the band. Tony was always the guy 1 year older than
Yeah,
Ozzy, and he sort of sets that up how Tony is the alpha male. He's the and of course I knew that, but I didn't quite realize to what extent. It really gave me a better sense of how it was really Tony was the guy, at the front of it, especially by the time they get to Technical Ecstasy and Never Say
yeah,
Die. Tony's
yeah,
really the guy trying to do things, and the other guys. I was a little disappointed that I never really. I mean, of course, I've heard all the guys. They all say like, "Oh, the last two albums we started to lose the plot," and I was really hoping that Geezer was. I knew that he wasn't going to like Never Say Die. Wasn't going to say a lot of great things about that, but I was a little disappointed in how much he put down Technical Ecstasy. I was that surprised me a little, but it
yeah,
was also so nice that he, like, even with Never Say Die, he didn't just totally shit on the album. He said, "Hey, there was some good stuff on it, Johnny Blade," and I
yeah,
forget what other
yeah.
things he mentions, but he mentions a couple songs. So like, yeah, these ones worked, but these didn't. So yeah, it was really cool the way I liked the way he talked about everybody, and like you said, yeah, Bill does come across as the guy who they all had drug and alcohol problems, but it it took a real toll on Bill, and
Yeah,
he is sort of the guy that uh, everybody else sort of. And Geezer has an interesting perspective because he's in and out of Black Sabbath. He was with Ozzy for the No Rest for the Wicked tour. He played on Osmosis. So he's in and out of the Ozzy camp. He's in and out of the Black Sabbath camp. So Geezer has a really interesting perspective on the whole thing. He seems to have been the guy that was friends with everybody, although he mentions having a falling out with Tony at one point, and but
mhm.
yeah, it gives you a different sort of look on. I would be really interested to now hear have Bill put a book out because Bill is he's the guy when he talks about Black Sabbath, when he talks about himself, you can tell Bill's a real soul searching kind of guy. And to hear
Yeah,
Bill's, I would be really interested to hear Bill tell his story
yeah,
around that 1980 to Heaven and Hell through Born Again. And because from all accounts, Bill was completely down and out, didn't have a penny, was didn't have a penny to his name, lost it all. And so it would be really interesting to hear Bill's story.
I get the impression though, and maybe it's the way that Geezer. I mean, my impression is built largely on the way that Geezer uh, portrays Bill in his book. Is that time when Bill would have been able to do that has probably come and gone. I'm not sure that Bill would even have the memory to be able
Yeah,
to go back and remember a lot of these things, probably the way that Geezer, of course, they all dabbled in drugs and alcohol, but and Geezer's pretty honest about it, but he doesn't. The impression I got was that the two main guys that got the most into the drugs and alcohol were, of course, Ozzy and Bill. Tony, you don't hear too much about it. Um, Maybe it's probably about as much as Geezer. The two of them are kind of like, they
yeah,
kind of paired off and they did their thing, but they weren't like hopelessly messed up as much as Ozzy and Bill seemed to be for most of the time.
yeah. I found it so nice too that Geezer opened up about. I didn't know this. I didn't know he had such issues with depression and having to be on medication and stuff like that. So it was really uh, I appreciated the fact that Geezer seemed to open up and let out some of his vulnerabilities, some of
Yeah.
his struggles and everything. I wasn't sure if we were going to get that because I kind of felt like Tony's book. It's been a long. I mean, when did Tony's book come out? I haven't read it since then. My memory
Ooh,
of Tony's book is that he's just a little bit more like, okay, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. He doesn't really, whereas Geezer does at times really sort of get into his own personal feelings and when he talks about his struggles with depression and his self-worth and stuff like that. I thought that was it felt like he was really opening up, and it was nice. All right, so there you go. The Geezer Butler book here. 3 out of the 4 original Sabbath members have put out books now. So let us
yeah.
know what you guys think. There's a lot of, you mentioned like not wanting to give away spoilers. I've been seeing all over like
I
Blabbermouth
have. I thought about that
Facebook, all
too,
these
but yeah,
quotes like, Geezer said this, and don't let those things, because a lot of times they're taken slightly out of
out of context.
context, and you really have to read the whole book and get the whole feel for the whole thing. So if you're somebody out there that again you think you know everything about Black Sabbath, I still think you're gonna learn stuff in here, and you're really gonna
For
feel
sure.
like you're gonna know Geezer a little bit better by the time you're done reading this book. So let us know in the comments down below if you've read the book. Let us know what you guys think. Let us know in the comments. Make sure you check out our podcast, Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast, and see you at the next Sabbath Sunday.